morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for another Upside Insight webinar. It's really good to see everybody here today. My name is Tracy and I am a nurse educator here at Insight. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we are presenting on today. So for us here, it is the Yagara and Turrbal people in Brisbane. I would also like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and I'd also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who might be joining us here today. It's my pleasure today to introduce and welcome Hazy Inseptember from Respect Inc., which is an organisation that provides health information as well as advocacy and support to sex workers across the state. Today, Hazy is going to talk to us about sex work, AOD and mental health, and we're also really lucky to have Dr. Alina Jeffries, who is the state coordinator for Respect, joining us as a panellist. So she's going to assist us with any questions that you might have as well. So just before I hand over to Hazy, a little bit of housekeeping. I think most are quite comfortable with Zoom after all our COVID times now. But if you have any issues, let us know by using the chat function and we'll attempt to assist. Likewise, excuse me, if you have any questions for Hazy or for the team, pop them in the chat and we will get them answered as we can or at the end of the presentation. Thank you very much, and over to you, Hazy.
Thank you very much, Tracy. So yeah, welcome everyone. Thanks for attending. Really appreciate this. As Tracy mentioned, this presentation is on sex work, AOD and mental health, working with sex workers. We're looking at this as professional development for people working mental health or the AOD settings with the sex worker cohort. So first up, as Tracy did here at Respect, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are on today. They are the Yagara and Turrbal people of Meanjin in Brisbane. And we pay our respects to elders of these tribes, past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty of these lands and rivers was never ceded. We'd also like to extend this respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. So I'm just adjusting things slightly as we get started. So, who is this funny person sitting in front of you? Well, my name is Hazy. I am the Career Development Peer at Respect Inc. Respect Inc. is a sex worker peer organisation. In my role at Respect, I help sex workers work towards their career goals in sex work or outside of it, sometimes even both in that aspect. I have a sex work history myself in the last 10 years and now specialise in therapeutic sex work. I also, outside of Respect, my name is Anthony Smith and I'm an LGBTIQ plus mental health officer for Queensland Council of LGBTIQ Health. So I'm a counsellor and I work both under the Be Mine program and National Suicide Prevention program in the clinical setting. I work with people across all kinds of issues and problems, but do a reasonable amount of drug and alcohol work just because of the cohort. And yeah, look, I have lived experience as both LGBTIQ plus and as a sex worker. So this workshop today, we'll start off with who Respect Inc. are. We'll look at what sex work is, explaining sex work in Queensland, statistics and demographics of sex workers in Queensland, the challenges that sex workers face, AOD usage in sex work communities, mental health in sex work communities, barriers to accessing services, and then recommendations for health and allied health. So this organisation I work for, who are they? So Respect is an independently incorporated organisation run for and by sex workers. So at Respect Inc., we deliver health promotion to sex workers and it's statewide peer education, training, advocacy and program that is funded by Queensland Health. We are a peer-run organisation that supports all Queensland sex workers, regardless of age, sector, gender, visa status, drug use status or health status. We're going to look at the values of the organisation because I feel like that's really important. It talks about how sex work is seen, I guess, through the eyes of the organisation. And this is often mirrored in some of the other organisations too. Each state has its own organisation. And there's an umbrella organisation known as Scarred Alliance, which also shares many of these values. So let's look at those. Our body, our business. So that includes autonomy, agency, empowering sex workers to make informed decisions about their own bodies. Nothing about us without us. So this is about community consultation and the concept that anything that affects the lives and rights of sex workers should involve sex workers' voices at every level and state. It's worth noting this is currently not the case in Queensland. The Prostitution Licensing Authority and the current legislation leave sex workers out of this. However, the sex work organisations and advocacy in Queensland is starting to make headway in raising understanding on how this impacts sex workers. Sex work is real work. This is really important as a value, right? It's the idea that sex workers operate as small businesses, and however, unlike other small businesses, we are regulated by the police. That's an important point. Rights, not rescue. Sex workers choose to do sex work and need the laws changed so we have access to human, workplace, political, health, civil, legal rights, the same as every other Queenslander. We don't need to be rescued. And finally, a note on terminology. So sex work is the preferred term. It's worth noting that legislation in Queensland uses the term prostitute, which generally our community considers offensive. In this presentation, we'll use that prostitute the title of certain laws and legislation. And if reading verbatim, we'll use the government terminology. For yourselves as practitioners or people working in allied health or health, it's a really good idea to just use sex worker or sex work, unless you're referring to legislation that uses the title. Okay. So who are sex workers? So sex workers include people of all gender who receive money or goods in exchange for sexual services. Sex work is negotiated sex that can take many forms and varies between and within countries and communities. And that's the World Health Organization. So sex work is an inclusive umbrella term that encompasses all aspects of sexual labour, recognises no race, class or gender, and acknowledges sex work as an occupational decision. So it's worth noting that service provider, brothel worker, and sex worker are all terms self-identified by sex workers working in the licensed brothel system. So you might hear some of those terminologies as well, which is important to know, right? And listening to the language people use and how they identify themselves helps us to be able to talk to the person and use the language that they use. So we're going to deep dive into the current framework in Queensland around sex work. So laws covering sex work in Queensland are complex, okay? Being made up of many layers of criminal laws within 5 different pieces of legislation. So this is tricky and difficult for sex workers to understand, even more compounded if English is not a sex worker's first language. In addition, a lot of the people who enforce the laws don't actually really understand it themselves, so police, and don't receive any formal training in this or working with sex workers. The criminal code criminalises many essential parts of our work as sex workers, including safety strategies. So working in pairs, hiring a receptionist to screen our bookings, even texting or calling another sex worker about where we are on a booking, or driving another sex worker to an outcall are actually criminal offences in Queensland. So many times in Queensland, sex workers must choose between working safely or legally in that process. Choosing whether to have someone for a safety call, which is working safely, but knowing that that might break the law. So the framework continued. Under the Prostitution Act, the only sex work businesses that can be licensed are approved brothels. Other traditional sex work businesses are criminalised. For example, escort agency, massage parlours, cooperatives where 2 or more sex workers work together, and street and bar work are all seen as criminalised forms of sex work in Queensland. It's worth noting that brothel workers make up a small percentage of workers in Queensland, with only 21 brothels in the state. It's mainly due to cost around licensing and regulations, keeps that number really small. Private workers make up the largest part of sex work in Queensland. So it's hard to know how many private workers there are in Queensland, but you know, it's well kind of understood that the majority of sex work in Queensland is happening outside of the legalised brothel framework. And maybe up to 95% of the industry is working currently privately. So Queensland has this two-tiered industry with those working legally and people working illegally, which we know is a large portion of sex workers, around 80%, due to how sex work safety is criminalised in Queensland. Often sole operators are working consistently. They have to choose whether to work legally or safely. So currently, Queensland has a licence framework with criminalisation and police regulation for all those who work outside licensed brothels. So here at Respect Inc., we're currently advocating for a decriminalised framework. Sex workers who fall outside of legal designations of work, either in a licensed brothel or completely alone, continue to be subjugated to police and criminalisation. In particular, migrants, refugees, LGBTIQ plus people, and individuals engaged in survival sex work are most at risk of criminal penalties in this instance. The Queensland legislation is being criticised as ineffective and is based on an incorrect assumption that sex workers in Australia pose as high risk to public health. And look, there are other frameworks that exist, such as criminalisation. It's worth noting that criminalisation and part criminalisation, such as the Nordic model, where clients are criminalised, exist out there. However, evidence indicates that sex workers continue to be arrested under different charges in the Nordic system. You know, activities that are still essential to working as a sex worker remain criminalised, which causes problems. These models do not reduce violence against sex workers, and sex workers do not support criminalised models. So we've talked about decriminalisation as possibly the way to go for Queensland. Queensland's currently looking at moving to a decriminalised route around sex work. So we're going to take a bit of a dive into some information around it. So decriminalisation is the removal of exceptional crimes that single out sex workers or the sex work industry for special police powers and regulation by police. Decriminalisation is not deregulation or no regulation. Okay. It allows the sex work industry to be regulated by a comprehensive system of pre-existing rules that govern other commercial activities that already exist. You know, things like workplace, public health issues, local planning and anti-discrimination, all those laws exist already. And the idea around decriminalisation is that that stuff is already covered. Sex workers don't need special laws. So why decriminalisation over other models? Decriminalisation in New Zealand has been found, led to an increase in sex workers' willingness to report crimes. 10 years after sex work was mostly decriminalised in New Zealand, 70% of sex workers reported improved sex worker and police relations. In New South Wales, it's led to major occupational health and safety advantages for sex workers, and that includes migrant workers in that, which are a particularly tricky population to often contact and have interactions with. There's strong evidence that decriminalisation leads to better health for sex workers in all settings and improved sexual health. The Lancet drew on 800 peer-reviewed studies in 2015 to conclude that decriminalisation alone would prevent 33 to 46% of new HIV infections within certain jurisdictions. Without criminal penalties, sex workers are less subjected to violence, whether from the state, i.e. law enforcement, or private actors, i.e. clients. When the threat of arrest is lifted, both sex workers and buyers are more willing to report suspected trafficking to law enforcement. Sex workers have better access to services and economic opportunities under decriminalisation, more control over their work, and a greater ability to pursue legal remedies in the face of violence or other harms. Decriminalisation would help communities disproportionately impacted by criminalisation, would help LGBTIQ rights, racial justice, gender equality, migrant rights, public health, and labour rights. So, International Labour Organization, World Health Organization, and Amnesty International identify decriminalisation as the best practice for labour rights and human rights in regards to sex workers. So there's all really big recommendations on why decriminalisation is the system that helps sex workers. And we're going to look into a bit more about why that's important. So next up, we're going to talk about diversity amongst sex workers in Queensland, because that's often overlooked. So at Respect, we collect stats from sex workers who contact the organisation. And it's allowed us to collect some really insightful information on the demographics of sex workers. And there isn't that much information out there, especially on Queensland, about sex workers and statistics and the demographics that make up sex work. So race, in respecting Queensland stats from 2021, Caucasian and English as first language make up 48.9%. Culturally and linguistically diverse is 46.8%, and First Nations is 4.3%. So, looked at race, we're going to move on to some sexual and gender diversity amongst sex workers, because again, this is something that is often overlooked. So, it can be a little trickier when at Respect, we don't necessarily ask sex workers about their sexual identity, but we can kind of pull apart some information from the stats collected. So, you know, when known or disclosed, Respect keeps de-identified records of the gender of sex workers accessing peer education. This clean data set for cultural background, age, and gender identity reveals some statistics on sexual and gender diversity among Queensland sex workers. So, amongst First Nation sex workers in Queensland, non-binary make up 41.5%, which is an interesting stat, right? Women, 39.3%, trans women, 13.3%, male, 3.4%, and non-disclosed, 2.7%. So, moving on to Caucasian and English as first language sex workers in Queensland. Women make up 71.5% of that sex worker cohort. Males, 7.9%. Trans women, 4.3%. Trans males, 0.8%. Non-binary, 5.4%. And people non-disclosing, because they might have contacted us by email or phone only, it's 10.1%. So continuing on with that, cultural and linguistically diverse sex workers in Queensland, gender identity, women is 40.9%, trans women 12.8%, male 8.1%, non-binary 6.9%, trans male 0.9%, non-disclosed email or phone contact only is a large number of 30.5%. And I can think that's interesting in itself too, right? About how people are contacting us in that process. The more difficult, you know, cultural linguistically diverse maybe aren't as comfortable coming into an office talking to people. So they are contacting us in ways that are a bit more anonymous. And as you can see, there's a strong correlation of transgender and gender non-conforming population amongst both the Indigenous and cultural and linguistically diverse people accessing the service. So around 50% in Indigenous and 30% in cultural and linguistically diverse. It's also worth noting that 20% of Caucasian and English speakers workers are either male or transgender, gender non-conforming. So strong anecdotal evidence of LGBTIQ plus people and people working with disabilities working in the Queensland sector. This is supported by literature and, from research in other countries that LGBTIQ plus people and people with disabilities do tend to favour sex work, and they make up part of the population. So why is this all important, right? Throwing a lot of stats at you. We're going to get to that a bit more, but I think the next part of, the jigsaw in this is a concept called minority stress, okay? So minority stress is the concept that sexual and gender minorities face unique and hostile stresses relating to their identity. These stresses have negative effects on their health, both mental and physical. Mayer, 2003. So this was originally theorized around LGBTIQ populations, okay? The idea that they face unique stresses and it often results in stigma and discrimination and impacts on both mental and physical health. So these stresses include external stressful events, such as a range of discrimination and prejudice, for example, ongoing alienation by family, all the way up to physical violence. Expectations of such events happening, which is a big one, right? Not only produces anxiety, but also calls for hypervigilance, which produces its own stresses. Possible internalization of negative societal attitudes. This leads to potential shame, guilt, and negative attitudes about sexuality, sex, and gender differences. And finally, concealment. So even those who are in some way out may still engage in some levels of concealment as part of their vigilance and safety strategies. So hopefully you're starting to get a bit of a glimpse as to why this would be relevant to sex workers as well, right? Not only because of the population, the people that make up, a percentage of sex workers, but also the ideas around how stress affects people, especially people in a minority group. So challenges sex workers face. Stigma and persistent negative attitudes towards sex workers continue to be a significant barrier to accessing health and other essential services, such as housing, financial, legal, and employment. This in turn can lead to internalized stigma. Framework in which sex workers are expected to operate in Queensland criminalises sex workers' safety. Entrapment by police is legal in Queensland and used against sex workers. So that's a biggie, right? This is a point. Sex workers are trapped by police. Entrapment is legal. This happens in Queensland. We hear it all the time at Respect. Sex workers face high rates of harassment and violence. And so minority stress and intersectionality also in those demographics. So the LGBTIQ population, disability, and cultural and linguistically diverse. So if you have, if you know about the concept of intersectionality and the Venn diagrams of how these line up, you can start to piece this together on the challenges that sex workers face. So in Queensland, about 50% of people engaging with Respect are cultural and linguistically diverse. About 10% of people in contact are male. About 10% of people in contact are transgender. And about 8% are gender non-conforming or non-binary. It's worth noting that disclosure of a job in the sex industry to people, possibly a mental health professional, could lead to things like criminal charges, loss of parental rights, financial hardship, if that includes losing like government support and benefits, okay? So with all that in mind, we've got a little exercise for you all. So this is a photo from one of the decriminalization rallies. I'm going to invite you all, well, first up, the majority in this people are sex workers. The majority of people in this photo are sex workers. And I'm going to invite you to choose one or more people in the photo and just notice and reflect on if that surprises you. Is that something you expected? What comes up for you? I'm going to give you a little bit of time on this, but, did you expect this person to possibly be a sex worker? What kind of story would you assume about the person? How would you react to this person if they came in to a session with however you are and wherever you're working and disclosed that they are a sex worker? And, what are you noticing around your emotions and thoughts about this person and the idea about their work? This is the kind of work that they do. So I just want you to hold those thoughts, notice them, be aware of them. We'll talk about that a bit more later. If I was doing this face-to-face, which I have done before, I like breaking people up into little tables and having these conversations about what comes forward. We don't have that ability today, however. All right, moving on. We're going to bust some myths around sex work. It's particularly a fun area. So, first myth, sex workers are vectors of disease. So, it's false, right? Queensland Sexual Health Strategy reports that the rate of HIV and STIs amongst sex workers in Queensland is low. Not only that, sex workers use condoms. Their condom usage is much higher than the general population at 95%. Sex work is a health issue. Sorry, sexual health is a health issue, not a criminal issue. Sex workers are uneducated, right? We have that classic trope of, sex workers, they haven't done any study, they haven't done anything. However, research shows that approximately 1/3 of indoor sex workers hold a university degree. That's 1/3. Makes us twice as likely as the general population to be university educated. So, classic myth, sex workers do sex work because we can't get any other employment options, right? So, most sex workers enter the industry due to benefits of the industry. And these benefits include things like flexible working hours, working for yourself, being able to have a great income, all that good stuff. Sex workers do not need rescuing. It's worth noting that in Australia, there's little to no evidence of systemic trafficking and pimping in sex work. And even worse, trafficking is no more prevalent in sex work than any other industry where people migrate to Australia to work. This includes hospitality, beauty therapy, and agriculture. Trafficking and exploitation are federal crimes and are much more common in agriculture and food production than in sex work, but yet this gets often very much conflated by people. Sex workers may or may not come from dysfunctional families, just like everyone else, right? Not all sex workers' families and friends are even against sex work. Many are supportive and know that these people, that person does sex work. Generally, sex work can be a great job, for students, for single mothers, for people with mental health or health problems. So people can't do 9-to-5 jobs. People who are wanting to supplement their income. Okay. Next one, all sex workers are more likely to be drug users or engaging in self-harm. So sex workers are on par with the general population for all drug use, but one drug. I'm going to invite you to throw into the chat some ideas on what that one drug might be that sex workers use more often. Ooh, ice, straight up. Caffeine, it's a good one. Alcohol. Great answers. So, I love it. Lots of responses from people. It's a little bit of a misleading question because it's not just an illicit drug. Viagra. There's always someone that says Viagra, which is great. So, sex workers are 70% more likely to smoke cigarettes than the general population. And we've had theories on why this is at Respect. But yeah, 70% more likely. Otherwise, the stats are the same as the general population. So sex workers are either high-end and earning heaps of money or homeless and survival workers. So it's a common myth that sex workers are either high-end or junkie horse stereotypes with that no in between. And look, these stereotypes do exist. However, neither is more or less valid. And all sex workers, regardless of circumstances, deserve respect and human rights. The majority of sex workers, however, fall somewhere in the middle. Sex workers can often even bounce between different sectors of the industry, sometimes at the same time. We have people who access the service who might be, high end. They might have a high end ad and they'll have a regular ad as well that pays their rent, but occasionally they'll get high end jobs through that process. It's really about being creative in that. So yeah, it's not a valid myth. Organised crime is involved in sex work. In Queensland, this is a myth. Sex workers are no more or less likely to be in contact with organised crime than anyone else. Finally, all sex workers are cis women. As discussed earlier, sex work is diverse. Sectors of the industry and people working in the industry are diverse. Sex workers are not all cis women. Sex workers are all from all countries and backgrounds, and sex work happens in every region of Australia, not just inner cities. Sex work occurs in regional Australia as well as inner cities. And it's worth noting, clients of sex workers can be just as diverse as sex workers themselves. It includes high-ranking political figures, CEOs, celebrities, sports stars, police officers, government officials, tradies, teachers, unemployed, drug dealers, literally everyone, even health professionals like us. Not all clients are male either. Female and gender diverse clients book sessions with sex workers every day. Some sex workers have been worked in the health industries and are still working in health industries, in the allied health or professional health. So being a client of a sex worker doesn't make you a criminal either. Doesn't make you a perpetrator of violence. And the mythology around the kind of services that clients request, say for kinky services or something like that, does not mean they are more likely to be a criminal or a perpetrator of violence. All right. Mental health of sex workers. This was interesting to research and look into in more depth. So Van Wessenbeck in 2001 notes that the mental health of sex workers has remained consistently appealing to social science researchers. Despite this focus, there's extensive flaws in the literature, such as a lack of representative samples reported on. Researchers have often used convenience samples of sex workers. So, example, street-based or incarcerated sex workers often make up heavily in the sample numbers, which is a biased, number. These sex workers may often experience compounding barriers to achieving mental health and not represent the average worker. Street-based sex workers make up the vast minority of sex workers in Queensland, okay? So around 2% of sex workers in Queensland, based on our recent data set from 2019 to 2021, are street-based workers. So it's 2%, and yet this makes up a massive bulk of any kind of research around sex work, especially in regards to mental health. So sex work research has often been conducted and published with little regard or context to the acknowledged limitations, often by researchers attempting to find psychological pathology. In addition, much of the research on sex work and mental health makes a lot of assumptions. For example, I love this part. Previous research has attempted to draw causal links between sex work and mental health by assuming that sex work is a symptom of trauma and that sex work itself is inherently traumatic. So the idea that people who do sex work must be inherently traumatized before they go into it. Sex work is not inherently dangerous or traumatic. Rather, it's the laws and the systems that put us at risk of violence and subject us to stigma and discrimination. Even more kind of, wilder, the limitations of sex work. Given the limitations of sex work research, the findings regarding mental health vary considerably. So amongst female sex workers, for example, rates of depression have been suggested to be between 10% and 100%. Rates of post-traumatic stress disorder between 13% and 89%. So this is wildly different. And the data points to specific problems with research done, about sex workers. Often demographic representations in research is skewed either towards sex workers who are incarcerated or in crisis. Or the flip side of that is it's just done for those who are more privileged in that aspect. So there needs to be some balance around the stats in that and how this information is collected. So because of this, it's really hard to draw any conclusions around the mental health of sex workers. So there's been some recommendations from literature and research in this. So instead of working from the point of view of individual sex workers' mental health status, it may be more useful for mental health practitioners to consider the systemic, social, and cultural barriers that sex workers as a community face to achieving mental health, such as stigma. So stigma and mental health. Some researchers suggest that most of the mental health issues sex workers face are, at their core, caused by stigma. These can also be compounded by existing mental health issues. Stigma is shown to result in poor outcomes in regards to mental health, often linked to anxiety and depression. Sex workers have reported that stigma, exclusion, and discrimination from people like family and friends and the wider community impacts their mental health. Many substance users also experience stigma that has a negative impact on their mental health. So we're starting to draw some of this stuff in, right? We're looking at like the idea around minority stress, that people already sitting outside of them, that idea of what is normal, especially around sex work and LGBTIQ plus and disability. They're already suffering from stigma and feelings of self-stigma in that. And this is compounded and causing mental health issues. Not only that, if someone is also a substance user, there's already some existing ideas around stigma in that. Moving on to sex work and drug use. So, not all sex workers take illicit drugs or prescribe medication, just like not all people take illicit drugs, prescribe medication. Some people who sell sex also take drugs. For many, drug taking is independent from sex work, but for others, it's intrinsically linked. For some sex workers, drug taking can be a part of a booking between the worker and the client. This does not necessarily mean that these type of bookings are problematic or linked to health issues. The current rate of sex workers who take drugs or prescribed medication in Queensland is not a topic that is validated by any data currently. Okay, the last information I could find was from like almost 20 years ago, and there's already discussions around the kind of how that was collected and the limitations of that study. Drug usage across sex work can be varied, right? So some people may engage in sex work to generate money to buy drugs, but the majority of sex workers see sex work as their occupation and not just simply a means to generate money to access drugs. In 2003, a survey of sex workers found that drug taking was way more common amongst the street-based sector, and this demographic were more likely to engage in AOD. So amongst street-based workers, cannabis was the most common drug of choice, followed by amphetamines. So a few of you before throwing that stuff around in the chat were spot on, but amongst a very, very small percentage of people. And this was stats from a long time ago as well, which again is worth keeping in mind. Previously discussed, street-based work is a tiny sector, less than 2% of the industry in Queensland. Sometimes clients will invite or expect workers to share in drug takings in bookings, with some clients specifically seeking out workers who can provide a party and play service. Some sex workers can experience pressure to take drugs with their clients. Drug taking for sex workers can include the standards, but also it can include other things. Can include things like performance-enhancing drugs, drugs to prolong erections, and sometimes even hormones, right? Depending on being able to get legal access to hormones. So it can be a wide variety of things. So with all this in mind, drug taking, stigma, discrimination, mental health, what might be some of the barriers that sex workers would face in accessing services, either mental health or AOD services? So this particular stat floors me, this first one. So in 2015, research showed that 31% of health workers self-reported that they would behave negatively towards sex workers because of their sex work. Let's just sit with that one for a second, right? 31% of health workers, and that was only the people who actually self-reported that. Imagine if that was another demographic, say a racial kind of culture or like a gender, right? 31% of people would refuse, or they'd work differently, negatively towards that person. Approximately 79% of sex workers in one study said they would be very unlikely or less likely to seek mental health support in the future because of past experiences of stigma and discrimination. 79%. That's a huge stat. 57.8% of sex workers did not feel comfortable disclosing to healthcare providers that they are a sex worker. And that's a barrier that sex workers face, right? They often don't feel comfortable in disclosing due to perceived stigma and discrimination, right? Sex workers report that mental health practitioners often framed them as victims, saw sex work as the root cause of their mental health issues, fixated on their sex work, and ignored other presenting issues, such as by taking overly detailed histories and keeping the exchange exclusively focused on sex work. So, accessing drug and alcohol services of sex work. Thanks to working in this organisation, I've heard some stories from people who have accessed services and the challenges that they have faced. And believe me, it's common. I feel like I could go into a whole section here, but I'm going to stick to the script, and we're going to just read this out for you. So this is by Ella, who is part of our service. I was a drug user and a sex worker for 5 years. During this time, I had many different interactions with accessing drug and alcohol services as a sex worker, and each time it was different. Some organisations weren't judgmental and followed a harm reduction approach. Others treated me like a villain or a waste of time and resources. Towards the end of my drug using, I went into a residential rehab. And during a meeting with my caseworker, the topic of sex work came up. Her reaction was fine. She was understanding. And then I mentioned something about it being an option in the future. If I get stuck for money, I could do a job occasionally. She instantly changed her attitude and started stressing to me that I can never, ever go back to sex work as it would be so harmful to my behaviour change program. She asserted that sex worker cannot ever be an option for me again if I want to maintain my program. In my fragile state, I really felt really judged and silly for even thinking that, and I believed her. It took me a couple of years to understand that everyone's experience with drug use and mental health is different, and I'm completely capable of doing sex work without taking drugs. I believe if she had taken the time to help me understand the trigger involved with sex work and drugs, as well as suggesting boundaries I might have needed to help prevent relapse, it would have been far more beneficial to my recovery. Okay. So we know demographics around sex workers. We know how the barriers that sex workers face in accessing services. We know a variety of information. So what can we do to provide support to sex workers? So if working with sex workers is not something you do regularly, don't be afraid to refer to someone who might be a peer or experienced in working with the population. Okay. Respect has a network of health professionals who have completed training around sex work sensitivity or have lived experience as a sex worker. This also doesn't mean you have to stop working with this person, but it can be really good to have someone who is a peer or has lived experience or has a sex worker sensitivity under their belt to be able to continue that work in that process, especially if you're in a therapy space and you have developed a good therapeutic relationship with the person. it can be really beneficial to have two people working, in different areas. Sharing resources and co-hosting activities with organisations and groups offering services to sex workers and people who use drugs is one way to create partnership that will add value to both. Such cooperation should ensure that the services offered are appropriate and help to make connections with local people who both sell sex and use drugs. So healthcare providers will require training on how to work with populations that are new to them and to confront their own biases. Practitioners should complete training themselves and not rely on clients to educate them, which is something I hear a lot in both the mental health space around LGBTIQ and also sex work. In addition to enhancing our own learning to improve the mental health of sex workers, there's recommendations in literature that practitioners engage in the self-reflection, address their inhibitions regarding sex and sex work, become sex worker friendly and sex positive, and make suitable referrals. Right? So that's what the literature says. In addition, there's recommendations of training topics for practitioners. And they include exploring our own anti-sex work and whorephobic biases and how intersectionality can intensify these biases, right? So sometimes our own lived experience and our own view of the world and how we've grown up and been socialized can actually increase our views on sex and sex work, which can lead to anti-sex work and whorephobic biases, okay? Really good to have training in cultural competence, especially as you saw with the large population of cultural and linguistically diverse sex workers who make up this, who make up the bulk of sex workers in Queensland. Being able to work non-judgmentally and having an understanding of concepts around compassion and social exclusion. Finally, we're coming up to our AOD services. So there's a great publication which is called When Sex Work and Drug Taking Overlap, which is by Ditmore 2013. And it makes various recommendations for drug and alcohol services who are working with sex workers. So service providers should not restrict access to their service and should make efforts to remove barriers to service access for those members of the community less able or inclined to seek support. And that's one of the big things we hear at Respect is people being barred from services or not allowed back into services because they've mentioned their sex work. Harm reduction and sex worker services often use an empowerment approach to health promotion, which does not simply seek to reduce harms and vulnerability, but also to improve participants' lives. Service providers may wish to create a safe space for the development of a network or collective and to support service users to advocate for their rights. Thank you all for attending. There's a QR code there. Feel free to grab a snapshot of it that leads to some great resources, including the resource on effectively working with sex workers and some other information about decriminalization. Also has a Respect website and contact details on it as well. So feel free to jump in there. We also have a evaluation survey that is going to be dropped into the link. Feel free to fill that out with any information you can give us. This is a pilot of this kind of training, and we look forward to doing it more, and any feedback you can give us would be amazing. I'm going to hand over back to Tracy. Thank you.
Thanks, Hazy. That was really, really good. I thought it was very interesting and eye-opening, and I think a lot of people will take a lot from this. Some of those stats were a bit confronting around the barriers and sort of health workers' perception, I suppose, and the way they're actually dealing with sex workers is quite sad. We do have a couple of questions from the audience. So one more, what are the known or some potential legal penalties for sex workers in Queensland when considering working with others illegally, or just some examples? Are they fined, jail time, both, etc.? Just have an understanding of what sex workers face in terms of legal risks.
Thanks, everybody.
I'll hand over to Eleanor Jeffries.
Hi, everyone. My name's Eleanor. I'm the state coordinator at Respect, so I'm Hazy's boss. I'm also a 47-year-old white cis woman who's been a sex worker for about 25 years. And I'm also an injecting drug user. And I also am a peer who has diagnosed mental health issues and in various programs. So the fines and the penalties for sex work have been in place for a long time in Queensland, but particularly over the last 20 years. I'm a white woman and I'm a cis woman. Sorry, what is white cis again? I might leave that for you and Google, because I don't think we've got enough time for that in this training. Thank you. So for example, we have advertising regulations that mean that the police can fine us if we use an incorrect word in our ad. Currently in Queensland, it's illegal to describe our services in our advertising. So if we put in our ad, hi, I'm a full service sex worker, my prices are this and it includes this, then the police can actually SMS me a penalty infringement notice of about $600. It's kind of like a parking fine, but they don't have to tell me which ad or what word was wrong when that happens. And that was has been at different periods the most common fine. About 6 years ago, the average fine for working together for safety was about $6,000 and included not a jail sentence, but if you do this again, you could go to jail for up to 6 months. But at the same, and that was really like in the same court next to each other, you could have an older Asian woman fined $6,000 and then a younger white woman fined $1,000 for the same crime. So it's arbitrary, was up to the judges. What we've seen in the last 2 years is a bit of a trend within the justice system in Queensland, where the appetite for punishing sex workers once in those court cases has really dropped off. Police charges have continued at the same rate. But what we've seen more of in the last couple of years is magistrates opting for no recorded conviction and fines of $1,000 or $400. So we think that the time is right for decriminalisation. We think that even though the police are still out there charging people, we do feel like we've noticed within the justice system a bit more sympathy towards sex workers' work and less inclination to the large fines that were more common about 10 years ago.
Can we just jump in there too really quickly? Yeah. I think an important thing to know about fines around sex workers too is that often things like phones, computers, anything like that is confiscated and kept as evidence. So imagine if you were like fined and everything that you related to your business was taken and held and you couldn't access. And that often includes cash as well.
Wow.
Yep. So really, not good.
No, that's impacting on all of life, isn't it? Not just your work when that sort of stuff happens. That's really harsh. We have got how can we help to decriminalise work in sex work in Queensland? And I see you've actually given us some links there that are really good. Just quickly, is there ways that people can sort of their petitions? How is it that you work?
And thanks, Ben, for popping those links in. And look, some of them are doubled up with what Hazy's provided in the QR code as well. So right now, the Queensland Law Reform Commission is considering the decriminalisation of sex work. We feel this is, a real sliding doors moment. We could absolutely change how Queensland treats sex work or the review could be mediocre and deliver not much change for us. It could even go the opposite, like it did in Canada when they were in the same situation, and actually bring in more criminal penalties instead. So you cannot underestimate how valuable it is for you to contact your local member and tell them that you care about this issue. It is perceived within politics that sex work is a vote-losing topic. We believe that that's not the case. We believe more people than politicians realise think that this is not just a police of waste time, but also a human rights abuses that are occurring. So we've got a whole bunch of links in there about supporting decriminalisation. And another question just popped up: how can you refer people to Respect? Yeah, so we've got a website that's got all of our opening hours and contact details there. It's also got a form, anonymous form, so you can, or put your phone number and things in for if you want to. People can make appointments, or sex workers can come into the offices or drop in or phone any time that our opening hours are happening. We have frontline peer educators available to engage with people, talk with people, and then also for specialist programs like the one that Hazy runs, it is better to make an appointment. But look, it's an open door policy to sex workers, and it's a sex worker only safe space during that drop-in time. Yeah.
And health professionals can get some information or support from you that way too? Or?
Absolutely, yeah, phoning up. It's not an open door policy to health professionals. So, yeah, phoning up, emailing, making a time. Yeah. We can come out to workplaces, do in-services. Yeah. We've found that it's not just the health professionals in a team that need that training. We really encourage workplaces to include their front of house and admin staff in the training too, because it's about changing workplace culture. Yep. We believe that higher levels of confidence to disclose is something that improves our mental health as a community broadly, and so that means all members of the team would really benefit from having a better understanding.
Excellent. I think we've got one final question before we sort of head off. Is it possible to be an NDIS provider as a sex worker? Now, I did see there was some link up there as well, also into the NDIS, but just briefly.
So under Commonwealth law, yes, thanks to a High Court case and a few other things, and also NDI, carers who have leaned on us for decades. Yes, you can. Sex workers can provide services under the NDIS. However, in Queensland, the involvement of any third party makes the entire exchange illegal. So currently in Queensland, Commonwealth NDIS systems is supportive of sex workers, but if we do it, the Queensland Police can charge ourselves, the carer, and the client for all operating outside of the law. So this is part of the decriminalisation, why it's so important.
Yeah. Oh, wow. It's quite complex too, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Very complex, probably more than what I sort of expected. Thank you again. That was really, really brilliant. So people have got lots of information there in that chat that they can access to get some more information if necessary. If you don't get that, if you miss those links as we sign off, contact us. We can send them out to you again. Next week we have another webinar, continues with Jack Freestone, who'll be talking to us about the GHB cultures, practices and experiences study. So we hope to see everybody join us in again for that one. But otherwise, thank you very much to Hazy and Alina. Have a great day, everybody, and we'll catch you next time.
Wonderful. Thank you.